Right. So, when did you get yourself a HOTAS?
Yes.
What HOTAS did you get?
Thrustmaster 16,000?
16? Yeah, the FCS HOTAS, right? It's like the
Yes.
combo. That is what I think a lot of people are going to start with if they get a HOTAS. They're either going to go dual stick or they're going to get what you get, or what you got. Let's go ahead and start binding you up here. So if you hit escape, go to options, key bindings, and then down there at the very bottom you should see mouse and keyboard. Go ahead and put that to joystick/HOTAS. Then hit advanced control customization. Yeah, and before we get into this too much, you've got everything unbound, right?
I do.
That is the first step because there are double ups on some stuff. So yeah, there's a lot of ways to bind your controls. However, there are some key things I think you should think about regardless of what your setup is, dual stick or HOTAS or whatever you have. And I've put a decent amount of time into trying to tune my setup like so it's more efficient. And really, this didn't necessarily come to a surprise to me, but really what I ended up with was more or less it's the same as most jet fighters. So you know how we were playing DCS the other day? We're
Yes.
probably going to set you up very similar to that, because let's be honest, they spent millions of dollars developing like where to put what controls and how to not bottleneck the user. And what I mean by bottlenecking is when you bind something like, let's say, like on the base of your stick, you see the 6 buttons on each side.
Yeah.
So let's say you bound your trigger, like your weapon group 1 to that, and then weapon group 2 on the other side. You'd have to use 2 hands to hit them, right? That's a bottleneck. You'd have to take your hands off the stick and push on both sides. And that's kind of an extreme hyperbolous example of this. Something else that maybe people might do is bind, say, strafe up to one of their hat switches, and then on that same hat switch bind Afterburner. So you couldn't use strafe up and Afterburner. See, it's a bottleneck. You're limiting yourself because of that, the way you've set up your controls there. Some of this stuff seems obvious, but over the years of playing Star Citizen, I've had a number of people tell me that, oh, well, this is just my preferred way. There isn't like a better way to do things. It's just all personal preference. And it is personal preference to a degree, but I absolutely think that there is more efficient ways to bind your controls than maybe some people do, and I think they would be objectively better off if they did so. So, now that we've got everything unbound for you, we're going to go down what the most important stuff is. Now, in flight cockpit, eject, all that stuff, like open doors, that stuff will come back to after we've finished everything else. Where we're going to
Mm-hmm.
start is in flight movement. And the very first thing we're going to bind is pitch, and it should be obvious what you're going to bind pitch to. Take a guess.
Forward and back.
On your stick? Yes, the y-axis. And here's where a preference thing comes in. There's two philosophies to this, to the yaw and the roll axis. And that is, you should have your yaw on your x-axis because there's more throw there. Therefore, you have more fine control. And that's true. I come from a flight sim background. I can never get used to that. So I bind mine to Z. But you can bind it however you want, so it's either going to be your x-axis or your twist on your stick. And then whichever one you bind the other one of those to roll. Once you have the yaw, pitch, and roll, we're going to get to our first kind of optional bind, which is match target velocity. This is something that you can come back to after we've set everything else. This is something that's nice to have. I mean, it's definitely not a necessity. At best, if you're flying with someone, you can target them and then match their velocity, and really that's the only thing it's good for. Next up is a big one, which is your speed limiter. So on your throttle, over there on the left side of it, there is a twist knob. For speed limiter ABS, bind it to that. Next is going to be something you absolutely want. That's going to be strafe up, strafe down. For you, where I'm going to tell you to bind this is your index analog stick, and what you want to do is bind the x-axis to strafe up or strafe up slash down. The next one is going to be strafe left slash right. So those little flappy doodads that's on like the front.
The paddles.
Yeah, the paddles. Next for you is going to be throttle forward, and you're going to bind that to your throttle. Next up, we're going to have strafe forward / back invert. On the back of your throttle, there are those two buttons. Bind it to the inner button. Next up, we're going to go down to cruise control. You're going to bind that to the bottom hat switch forward. Next up, Afterburner, bind that to that other button that's on the front of your throttle, the outermost one. Next up, we got landing systems, and I think a good place for this is down on the bottom hat switch on the side of your throttle.
Yeah, because you're pressing down and you expect the landing gear to go.
Next up is toggle Vtol, and that's going to be on that same hat switch up. Okay, lastly in flight movement, you have quantum travel toggle and quantum drive. These are going to be bound to that same button, and it's going to be the button that is on the side of your throttle.
The one at the bottom.
Yeah. So basically you'll tap it to start spooling, and then you'll hold it to actually jump once you're ready.
Just like you would on the keyboard.
Yeah, exactly. Next up, we're going into targeting. You're going to scroll down probably about, I don't know how many this is, like maybe 10, and you're going to see select target under reticle. You want that to be on your joystick, the hat switch, forward. Next up, we have cycle all targets, and you want that to be left or right on the hat switch, doesn't really matter. And then cycle all targets back, make it the opposite, so if you made it left, make it right. Lastly, I think oh no, it's not the last thing in here, but it is one of the last things. It's going to be target nearest hostile.
Yes. Back on the
Yes, back on the hat. Let's see, scanning mode. This is something it's going to be nice to have for sure. So for scanning mode, this is going to be the top hat switch on the side of your throttle, and we're going to make it up. Above this, I forgot, scanning radar ping. You're going to make that your trigger.
Trigger on the joystick.
Yep.
As with scanning mode enabled, that's not going to fire any weapon.
Yeah. If you have scanning, when you have scanning mode on, when you use that, you can't fire weapons, so it doesn't interfere with anything.
Right.
And the last thing in targeting is scanning increase angle and scanning decrease angle, and you want that to be forward on your hat and back on your hat. What you're going to bind to mining mode is the top hat on the side of your throttle down. Next up, you have fire mining laser. You can make that your trigger. Switch mining laser toggle. Make that back on the top hat on the side of your throttle. There's two ways you can bind this to an axis, maybe more for you. What I'm going to tell you to do is at the bottom of the base of your joystick, you have that extra throttle where it says increase / decrease mining laser power. Bind it there. You could also bind it to where I told you to bind your speed limiter, and that works too. And it won't change it until you go back into flight mode. And then, like if you had it at 100%, your speed limiter is going to be 100%, and you might fly off super quick. So you got to remember. So I mean, I think it's better on the side-scrolling thing where your pinky is. However, like as a safety thing, I think it's also a good idea to keep it on the something different.
Yeah.
Next up, we're going to have flight weapons. And for fire weapon group 1 and fire weapon group 2, make that your trigger.
So just be firing everything all at once.
Right now, there's no use for weapon groups as far as I'm concerned. Like, you pretty much always want to be firing everything all the time, so I just bind it all to the same. Next up, this is something you probably do want to have bound for sure, because every time you get into a ship, essentially you have to change this. And it's cycle gimbal assist / standard gimbal / gimbal lock modes. Where we're going to bind that, next to your hat switch, you have, or below your hat switch, you have those 3 buttons. Bind it to the one that's on the right. Acquire missile lock, you want that on the center button that's just below your hat switch. For launch missile, you want to bind it to the same key.
Right, so they're both going to be on the same one.
Yep. That's it for flight weapons down to flight defenses. First off, we're going to start with launch countermeasures. That is going to go on the middle hat switch on the side of your throttle forward. Next, you're going to have cycle countermeasures. That's going to be that same hat switch backwards. I think that is all of the absolute needed controls. There are some power settings, at this point we can start talking about those buttons on your base and some what I consider more optional things. I'm not aware of all the current details of this patch for power management, but I don't think it's really at a point to where it's super important. So we're going to bind these to the base of your joystick. Power setting 1, 2, and 3, just make it 1, 2, and 3 across. Next, we're going to have power toggle, and from here we can scroll up to the top again to flight cockpit. So for flight/system ready, you can go ahead and make that the same button. And what that does is it kind of works in like you push it, your ship turns on. You push it again, your ship turns off. Next up we got Eject Self-Destruct. Next one is a pretty good one to have, especially if like you're us and we do a lot of multi-crew stuff. Toggle open/close doors. And this leaves us with one button on your joystick, I believe. Maybe some other, like some of your hat switches still have empty spaces. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing though, because you just want like one function in places.
Mm-hmm.
That left thumb on the joystick's a pretty good button. It's a pretty premium button. So I'm just trying to think what we could put there. So where it says switch flight lead/vertical toggle, make it that left button. So you know that two-way hat that's on your joystick?
Yes.
That's going to be your push to talk, because that allows you 2 communication inputs. So you can have one for Discord, and you can have one for in-game.
Ah, right.
Makes sense, right?
Yeah.
So if you go down to VoIP, and head tracking,
Yeah.
you should see push to talk. VoIP push to talk is going to be better, because if you're in a ship, then proximity, right? It's like, I don't know. I'm thinking more of like you're using it to communicate with like someone who's hailing you.